So I reached here for river cruise. I think this is the place I need to show my ticket. Started raining now. Chicago Children's Museum. Here they exhibited the history. Shoreline sightseeing. So this is the advantage here. River cruise, we can enjoy the beautiful buildings and the architecture. Shoreline Sightseeing Company. It is set to start. Another 5 minutes to go.
I just want to let you know about a couple important things. First of all, bathrooms, those are important, located at the back of the boat.
The seats, or sit on the seat backs or the railings. We just want to keep you safe and inside the boat. And once we get underway, then
A little bit of framing for how we're going to be talking about the architecture we're looking at today. And I'm going to be focusing on three aspects of architects. That is that architects are artists, they're social scientists, and they're engineers. Let's dig into that. Architects are artists. I would like you to, if you can, think of the Chicago skyline this evening as a museum of art. And each building that we're going to talk about is its own unique work of art. And much like architects are social scientists. So much of what we'll be doing today is we'll be using what we see, the style, the design, and the features of each of these buildings to, in a sense, decode them and learn about what was going on when they were built. Yeah, what was the country like? What was the city like? What were the hopes, dreams, worries, fears of the people that lived? Question of why we have the architecture that we have, yeah? So, without further ado, sit back, relax, and enjoy this Shoreline Sightseeing Architecture River Cruise on this stunning Sunday afternoon here in Chicago. All right, folks, it's going to be a moment before we turn right and make our way onto the main branch of the Chicago River. So until then, I want to start by pointing out this super exciting, really interesting pile of dirt covered in grass to our right. Now, I am mostly joking, obviously, but I point it out because it is a staging ground. And a staging ground is basically a building, an empty lot used for building construction. So there are two new buildings that are going to be built on the other side of this bridge here. And they're using this lot to store equipment and materials. You can see that construction trailer in the background there. But more importantly, when this is done being used as a staging ground, this is the future home of DuSable, founder of the city of Chicago. His full name was Jean-Baptiste Pont-du-Sable, but that's a mouthful, and it's the Midwest, so we just call him DuSable. He was the first non-indigenous permanent settler. He was an immigrant from Haiti of French and African descent. And so it's very exciting. City Council voted to create DuSable Park right here at this lot. It's probably going to be another 3 to 4 years before we see it. But it's at a really stunning location here out by the basin. Nearly as important as he was to the foundation of Chicago. And a good example of that is this bridge we're about to pass under. Now, you'll notice it says Lakeshore Drive on it. And this is the street that travels all the way along the lakefront up to the north side of the city. It empties out into a neighborhood called Edgewater, which is where I live. But last year, City Council voted to rename Lakeshore Drive Jean-Baptiste Pont-du-Sable Lakeshore Drive. But that's even more of a mouthful. So we've already shortened it to DuSable Lakeshore Drive. The nice thing, even though we've got a little bit of rain today, we still have incredibly clear skies, so you're going to get some really stunning views, including this first one here as we pass out from under this bridge. Brace yourselves. Still one of my favorite parts of the tour coming out from under that bridge there. Kind of cinematic, isn't it? Covered in different shades of blue and green glass. One of the newest buildings in the Chicago skyline. It was just finished about a year ago. Currently the third tallest building in the city of Chicago. This is the stunning St. Regis. Now the St. Regis is a high-end residence and hotel. Now the residences have been open since it was completed last year, so she designed Maggie Daley Park. That's a beautiful park here downtown. Also a couple boathouses for the city, and she's currently working on a redesign of parts of O'Hare International Airport. Now she beat out a lot of well-known, well-established male architects from around the world to land that contract. So that shows you just how incredible Jeannie is. Our way down the main branch of the Chicago River. And this direction that we're traveling in is west. Now, that is also the same direction that the water is flowing. So the water is flowing west, and then up ahead, it makes a left onto the south branch of the Chicago River, and eventually, on the other side of the state of Illinois, it empties into the Mississippi River. But, believe it or not, when Chicago was first founded, starting back in the 1770s, this river flowed in the opposite direction, and it emptied into Lake Michigan. So why and how did the direction of the river change, yeah? Well, when Chicago was first founded, like many US cities founded on rivers, it treated this river like its sewer. And I mean that in every single definition of the word sewer. So all the city's waste was dumped into this river, and that was emptying into the lake. He likes to stand up on the Columbus Drive Bridge and welcome to folks to Chicago on these boats with bubbles, because as he says, everyone loves bubbles. You kind of can't disagree with him, can you? Chicago was using Lake Michigan as their source of fresh drinking water, right? So you can understand why that needed a change. Well, starting in 1892, the Army Corps of Engineers dug a 28-mile channel out to the west and south. They connected the Chicago River to the Mississippi River system, and they dug that channel on a decline and relied on gravity to change the direction of flow. As you've heard of Wrigley's Juicy Fruit Gum or Wrigley Field where the Cubs play, that's the same Wrigley. Now, this building was built in the early 1920s, and it's modeled specifically after a cathedral in Sevilla, Spain. So we call this style Spanish Revival style architecture. And this building is covered in 250,000 glazed terracotta tiles. Now, terracotta is a substance more fragile than porcelain. So to clean the exterior of that building, they have to get up there on ropes and use brushes with soap and water to scrub it. They cannot use high-pressured hoses because it would damage that terracotta. That's because in the early 1920s, our architects here in the US didn't quite have their own styles yet. $17 million. A nice little starter home. Now, that fella never moved in, and he resold it last year for $20 million. A nice little $3 million pocket change profit. All right, folks. Eyes up, cameras up to the right. One of my absolute favorites on the river, the iconic corncob towers of Marina City. Now, Marina City was designed and built in the 1960s by architect Bertrand Goldberg. And Goldberg, he was more of a social scientist, so he was really interested in how people lived, not just where they lived. So with Marina City, he was looking to design a fully self-contained city within a city. And that is exactly what he did. Ah, the beautiful soundtrack of the city, yes. Always trying to upstage me. Now, if you moved into Marina City in the 1960s, here's how it worked, right? You're gonna live upstairs where you have to furnish a pie slice shaped apartment, and then you're gonna live above your valet parked car, your parked yacht, because who doesn't have a yacht? And then you're gonna live above a restaurant, movie theater, bowling alley, shops, and office space. We like to call Marina City an introvert's dream world. Buildings on the river, so that has changed quite a bit in recent years. Yeah. Now, this is a 1.3 mile continuous stretch of Riverwalk that actually wasn't completed until a few years ago. Started in 2003, it cost $112 million. But not only has it brought more people down to the river's edge than ever before, but it has brought a lot of businesses as well. So once the summer months hit, you'll notice how busy this Riverwalk can become. All right, this building here to the left with the white granite base and the reflective mirror glass. This is 77 West Wacker Drive, and it's a great example of the neoclassical style. Now, the way the neoclassical style works is you take key traits or features of classic architectural styles, like if you look all the way to that roof, it looks like a bit like a Greek or a Roman temple, yeah? So you take those features and you add it to a more modern looking building that's built with modern materials, and that's your neoclassical style. Now, this is the only building we'll see on the river designed by a Spanish architect, Ricardo Bofill of Barcelona. To the left where that building is located has a nickname. It's called the Loop. And it's called the Loop because our public trains, which also have a nickname, they're called the L, which is short for elevated, as a lot of the tracks are raised above the ground. The L runs in a loop around this downtown city center. I am a huge fan of the CTA, that stands for Chicago Transit Authority. They're the group that runs the buses and trains in town. And I recommend if you are traveling from outside of the city and you're not quite sure if you want to travel on the train or the bus, I'm here to tell you it's a lot easier than you think it is, and you will not regret it. It's a lot cheaper than an Uber or a Lyft, that's for sure. Hey, 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 skedaddle. All right, folks. Something important to know about Chicago is that we honor our architectural heritage. There is a deep respect for what came before. examples of what I mean by that more specifically coming up here. On the left is this first building here. This is the Builder's Building, and you'll notice a black stripe of windows down the front, yeah? The section to the left of that stripe was built in 1927, but the section to the right was 1987, 60 years apart. But you can tell how the architect with the addition on the right honored the original intentions of the first. Yeah, it's the same basic style, same basic design. It's just a little bit more modern, a little updated. Well, the Wells Street Bridge we're about to pass under is another fantastic example of that, because even though this bridge looks like all the other iconic Chicago-style bridges that you see on the river today that are 80 plus years old, this one's only 9 years old. And that's because it was built as a replica so that it would fit in to the architectural heritage of these iconic Chicago bridges. All right, folks, eyes up, cameras up again to our right. Another one of my favorites, the massive Merchandise Mart from 1929. You see on the river, but we're going to see a lot of it. Here are the key traits of the Art Deco style. First, you have the deep inset windows, which create vertical racing stripes. And that's intended to draw your eye towards the top of the building. It's covered in a lot of repetitive patterns, and then it's finished with polished Indiana limestone and metal ornamentation. Now again, this is the Art Deco style from the second half of the 1920s. This building was 1920s, for a machine-made future full of airline travel, fancy cars, new technologies. And so the Art Deco style was intended to express that optimism. Folks, another one of my favorite parts of the river, this is Wolf Point, where the three branches of the river come together. This is sort of the heart of the Chicago River. It's also where the city was first founded back in the 1770s. Just a couple trading posts and taverns here at Wolf Point, which is kind of hard to imagine now, looking at all this construction here today. Now that building straight in front of us with the red sculpture in front, this is River Point. And you'll notice that upside down U on the bottom, yeah? The base of that is actually pushed further back. You kind of can't see it from here. And the idea is they created that U-shaped base so that they could have a little bit more space in the front of the building for people to gather for some Riverwalk space. Boxy building that you're seeing coming into view up ahead on the left side of the river. This is the historic Fulton House, built all the way back in 1898 as a cold storage freezer building for the meatpacking industry. Now, Chicago was the meatpacking capital of the country for much of the 1800s, so there were many of these buildings down here, and they didn't have any windows. They were just like big for inside. Now, in 1971, the meatpacking industry that operated in Fulton House, they sold the building, they left, and when the builders got inside to renovate it, it took them over 3 months to thaw the building out. And that's because when they got inside, they discovered 4-foot thick walls that were stuffed with matted horsehair and cork, which was a Fulton House. All right, you see this raised bridge here to the right? This is the old Carroll Street Railroad Bridge. It is no longer in operation, though it does lower once or twice a year for maintenance, just to make sure it's still operational and safe, more importantly. But it's a great example of how much weight you need to lift one of these concrete, or one of these steel structures in the air. So that big chunk of concrete on the right is what's called the counterweight necessary to lift this bridge up. All right, folks, one of my triangles on the roof. This is the River Cottages from 1988, designed by architect Harry Weiss. And people thought that Harry Weiss was crazy for building a residential building on the north branch of the river in the 80s. That's the branch we're on right now. And that's because in the 80s, this branch was still especially gross. It was super polluted, there was trash in it, it smelled bad, so people didn't really want to be next to it. But because of architects like Harry Weiss, the city's relationship with the river has shifted dramatically. We've talked a bit about that already. I have a couple good examples of that coming up ahead. And here is the East Bank Club, high-end fitness center from 1980. And you'll notice that this building treated the river like an alleyway, right? This is the back of the building. And that's because in 1980, they didn't want people to come out here and smell the gross river and see the trash in it. But if you look to our left, just 21 years later, these residential townhomes were built. And you can see how things had shifted dramatically. This is the front of these buildings with a big walkway, some green space, and balconies. And we'll talk a bit more about that shift in a moment. But first, I'm gonna hop off the mic for just a few short minutes for our first little break here while we make a U-turn and head back down. So when a building sways, what it's doing is it's relieving the stress on the foundation so that it doesn't crack or get damaged. But we also don't want it to sway too much because that would also be bad. So there are a few ways you can cut down on the sway of a building. And the system that 150 North Riverside uses is called inertial slosh dampers, and that's a mouthful, so let me explain how it works. On the top floor, there are 12 concrete tanks full of 160,000 gallons of water. And I'm going to be the building and give you a demonstration, okay? So say the wind hits the building on this side, yeah? Well, it's going to sway over here. But when it sways over here, the water in those tanks will slosh in the opposite direction, which brings it over there, and so on and so forth. And that basically has an equalizing effect, and it brings the building to rest much more quickly. It's a pretty incredible innovation for a building like 150 North Riverside, and that's because this lot was empty for many years because no one wanted to deal with it. They were testing how long does it take to build a new building on the river these days. Well, we have a perfect example here to our left. This is the Bank of America building, finished about a year ago. It cost roughly $800 million and took about 3 years to construct. Pretty standard for a building this size. Now, if any of you are patrons of Bank of America, you helped pay for this building, so congratulations, your child is beautiful. Now, one of my favorite features of this building is the specific kind of reflected glass they used on this side, and the idea was they wanted it to reflect the sky on the other side of the river so that it would almost look like it blends in with the sky behind it, yeah? So it sort of takes away that pressure of a massive building next to you, and it opens things up. All right, folks, we're about to embark on a short history lesson on the evolution of Chicago architecture with this Art Deco building here. Now, of course, you can tell it's Art Deco because of the repetitive patterns and the limestone finish. And again, this was 1929, the Roaring '20s, the Jazz Age. I mentioned earlier there was a lot of excitement and optimism in the air. But that same year, the stock market crashed. And that sent the United States into the Great Depression. This was the greatest economic downturn we've ever faced here in the US. And then, in the 1940s, World War II came around. So, from about 1930 to 1957, roughly, there were basically no new office buildings built anywhere in the country. It was sort of a commercial building drought, so to speak. We had more important stuff to spend our money on, yeah? But then, in the late 50s and 60s, when architecture was rebooted with modern style, also sometimes referred to as Miesian-style modernism, after Mies van der Rohe himself. Now, remember that the people that were living and working in the 50s and 60s, they grew up during the Depression, right? So they didn't want to spend more money than they absolutely had to. And they certainly didn't want to argue about how many gargoyles to put on the roof or what kind of limestone. What it's intended to do, you don't need to do the 50s and 60s with moss. With this white box up here on the right from 1971, the Fifth Third Center, and this is an example of the international style of architecture. Of course, it has that name because it was a very popular style all around the world in the 1970s. You can see it in pretty much any major city across the globe. And it's very similar to these black box buildings, but it's lighter and brighter. Yeah, it's made with stone or concrete instead of that iodized black aluminum. This building with the curved wall of reflective glass windows, that curve reflects the neighborhood and makes things look good. Again, it flatters the context of the building. So there you have it. The Art Deco, the late 20s, that drought from the Depression of World War II. We get modern styles, but not an architectural observation. I just think it's a building marketing strategy. Standard black box building, nothing special, but back in 2014, the owners really wanted to be special. So they spent over $800,000 to put themselves on the map by putting the map on themselves. So this is a 2-scale map of the Chicago River. That red brick up there is basically the "You Are Here" dot. This massive stone building is the old Main Post Office from 1921, but you might recognize it as Gotham City Bank from the beginning of 2008's The Dark Knight. So this is the building that the Joker and his henchmen robbed. He drove a bus on the first floor on the street. My friend Brian is an actor and a stuntman based here in Chicago, and he actually played the henchman that ziplined into the roof of the old Main Post Office at the beginning of that film. Now, his character was immediately killed, so it was a very short-lived appearance, but he still had a great time, and they let him keep the creepy clown mask he wore. Now, when that movie was shot in 2008, this building was empty. It had been abandoned since the early 90s, but then a few years later, it was purchased and renovated, and a lot of money was poured into it. So all in all, like I said, things are a little slower, a little quieter down here. Now, up ahead, we'll be making a U-turn. We'll be coming back north so I can talk about some of these massive buildings that I know you're all waiting for, so do not worry, we will get to those. It's about the Great Chicago Fire. About a half mile to our right, a fire broke out in Mrs. O'Leary's barn. We know that's where it started, but we'll talk about how it get started in a minute. We also know that 30-mile-per-hour winds over the next few days made it one of the most devastating urban fires in the history of civilization. In fact, at two separate moments, those winds created fire cyclones, which actually jumped over the river and spread the damage even further. At one point, the river itself was on fire. This fire raged over the course of 3 days, and when the last flames were put out, over 7... Remember her? It was her barn where the fire started. We know that much. She was an Irish Catholic immigrant. There was a lot of animosity towards Irish Catholic immigrants in the city at that time. Chicago was angry. They wanted someone to blame. In Chicago rebuilding itself after the devastation of the fire. You know that he had done that. They asked him if he would redraw the map of the city of Chicago. And so he drafted the Burnham Plan of 1909, and this is a hugely important part of Chicago's history. The fire destroyed, the fair animated, and the plan beautified. And of course you can trace it all the way back to that poor cow. But like I tell everyone, I don't want you to worry about Mrs. O'Leary and her cow because City Council promptly exonerated them both. This is River City. Do you guys remember the corn cob towers of Marina City from earlier on? This is the same designer, Bertrand Goldberg, and it's the same concept, a city within a city. Those two lower levels with the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, those are your commercial spaces. And of course, what city within a city would be complete without somewhere to park your yacht? All right, folks, this is a really, really awesome time to come out on the river because you get to see something we don't often see, and that's this construction right here to the right. So this is going to be a residential building called the Reed when it's finished. And when we finished our previous season at the very beginning of January, this wasn't here. So this has popped up in just about 3.5 months or so. And it's a really good example of how rapidly the edge of the river is transforming these days. It's a skyline so that I can introduce you to the royal family of Chicago. Straight ahead, this massive black tower with the 2 white antennas on top, the tallest building in the city of Chicago, the goddess herself, the Sears or Willis Tower. Now, right in front of the Sears, you have the Queen. That's that pink granite building with the barrels up on top, or 311 South Wacker Drive, named after its address. But I want to start by talking about the Princess, and that's this building over here on the right that's just coming into view with the statue on the roof. Kind of looks like the Oscar statuette, yeah? This is the Chicago Board of Trade building from 1929. It's another Art Deco building. You can see those racing stripe windows. And Ceres is the goddess of agriculture, which is fitting because the Board of Trade is originally where Chicago traded agricultural futures on the stock market. Wacker Drive with the big green barrels up on top. Now, this building was finished in 1990, and originally at night, those barrels were lit up with over 1,800 fluorescent tube lights. You can imagine how bright that was. Now, those have mostly been replaced with LEDs and energy-efficient bulbs, and that's because when the building was first built at night, when the barrels were lit up, migrating flocks of birds would mistake the roof for the moon, and it would disrupt their flight patterns in a major way. That's why twice a year now in the spring and fall months, those barrels are dimmed significantly so it doesn't interrupt the birds' flight patterns. In fact, it was a great lesson for the city of Chicago. Now we take that much more seriously than we did before. And so many of the buildings in town are required to dim their lights on the roofs during migration season. Which brings us back to the goddess, the Sears or Willis Tower, depending on who you ask. Now, back in 1974, Sears department store built the tallest building in the world right here in the Windy City. That was the Sears Tower. Now, that company left the building and the city in the early 90s, which was a bummer for us. They were a large employer. But then based in the Sears Tower out of 110. And in that lease was also a clause that said for an extra $1 million a year, they could also lease the naming rights. So for $1 million a year, the Willis Insurance Group gets to call that building the Willis Tower. Now, I've been in Chicago long enough, I consider myself a local. And like the locals, I'm stubborn. So I still call it the Sears Tower, looking for it on a map. That's what you're looking for, the Willis. Now, much like 150 North Riverside, that building is designed to sway up to 18 inches in either direction. That is 3 feet total. You measure the height of a building. Where do you start? Where do you stop? Who sets the rules for that? Well, the Council on Tall Buildings, which is the actual very original name of that council, has determined to measure a building's height. You start at the threshold of the lowest open-air public entrance, so that's basically the bottom of the lowest public doorway that isn't underground, and you measure it all the way to the top of the structure, or permanent spire. And permanent spire is relevant with the Sears because those two antennas are not considered permanent, so they don't actually count towards that overall height. Now, the Sears was the tallest building in the world for 24 years, which is an incredible amount of time to hold that record, especially nowadays. But the tallest building in the world right now is the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. It's over 2,700 feet tall, which makes it almost twice the height of the Sears Tower. Now, who designed the Burj Khalifa? None other than the world's tallest architect, Adrian Smith, who I mentioned earlier is the architect of Trump Tower. Another Chicago guy. All right, quick glimpse of the side of the Sears through this gap here. You see those 5 glass boxes sticking out of the side of that tallest tower? Yeah, that's the sky deck. Those are called the ledge. And if you'd like, you can get a ticket. Take the elevator up to that floor, walk out into one of those glass boxes, look through the glass floor all the way down to the street below. Now, that sounds like fun to you. Go for it. This comedy club here called the Second City. In fact, a lot of writers and performers on Saturday Night Live start off their careers at the Second City. It's one of their unofficial training grounds. And you know the reason why that is one of our nicknames, and that's because the first city burnt down. This is quite literally the second one. Another nickname is the Windy City. This one's probably our most well-known name, and on a day like today, it seems absolutely appropriate, right? Well, we don't actually get our name from the wind. It actually comes from the World's Fair that I mentioned earlier. So, leading up to the fair, a lot of locals from Chicago had to go to New York City and Washington, D.C. and beg the powerful elite to give them money and support to host the fair here. And in a now infamous quote, one of those powerful elite referred to them as those windbag blowhards from Chicago. We then got the reputation of being a city full of windbags, and that was shortened to the Windy City. And that is the true name, the true story of the nickname, the Windy City. Another nickname we have, this is a little older, is the City That Works. And we got that nickname because we have, for many, many years, had a large working class population here. We're proud of that reputation. But if you ask me, we're the city that works because we're the city that functions. And we're the city that functions because we are a well-rounded city. We have a vibrant arts and culture scene. So here to the right is the Civic Opera Building. This is the second largest opera house in the country. Currently home to Lyric Opera of Chicago. That is a world-renowned opera company. And Chicago is home to over 200 theater companies, ranging in size from small little 40-seat storefront theaters all the way up to cultural mainstays like the Goodman Theater, Steppenwolf Theater, Chicago Shakespeare Theater. So of course, you've got deep dish pizza, Chicago-style hot dogs, Italian beef, Italian ice, popcorn, believe it or not. We're known for our gourmet popcorn. Garrett's, popular place here to eat popcorn. Their specialty is half caramel corn, half cheddar cheese popcorn. Sounds kind of wacky, but don't knock until you try it. It's pretty delicious. There has been a long-raging debate about where to get the best deep dish pizza in the city, and I'm going to enter into that debate right now. So there are 3 chains of deep dish pizza in Chicago that you can't go wrong with. They all make delicious pizza. Those are Giordano's, Lou Malnati's, or Gino's. All fantastic. But for my money, the best place in the city to get pizza is at a place called the Pequod's Pizza. It's spelled P-E-Q-U-O-D. It's up in a neighborhood called Lincoln Park, and they bake their pizzas in cast iron skillets, which gives them an incredible caramelized crust. Can't beat it. And then I have one last food tip for you, and this is especially important for those of you visiting the city for the first time, except hold that thought, because what an iconic moment. You get to see the L in action here, raised above the Lake Street Bridge. Just gotta stop talking so you can take that. So here's that last thing too, okay? Especially if you're here for the first time. All right, so listen closely. If you would like to get a hot dog while you're here, whatever you do not ask for ketchup on it. Now, I have no idea why that's a rule here. No one else seems to know either, but it is. And if you ask for ketchup on your hot dog, you're probably going to be judged by everyone around you, including the person you ordered it from. That happened to me when I moved here years ago. But if you want to get a Chicago style, which is my favorite way to eat a hot dog, you're going to ask them, and this is true, to drag it through the garden. And they're going to put pickles, peppers, relish, tomatoes, onions, mustard, and celery salt on it. And if you're looking for any recommendations on where to get any of the food we just talked about, let me know off the tour, and I've got plenty. Chicago, 360 degrees of amazing is what we like to say. Some more construction here. You can see the future Salesforce Tower. Going to be finished in about a year. Now, a lot of people will ask, I don't know if you can see, well, yeah, you can see it there on the side. You see that crane arm sticking out over the side of that building there, yeah? It's a great question. People ask, how do they get pieces of equipment up on the top of these skyscrapers when they're building them? And it's usually one of two ways. The first, which is cheaper, is to dismantle the equipment and bring it up on a freight elevator piece by piece and reconstruct it on the roof. More expensive way, but easier way, is to have it airlifted onto the roof by a helicopter. In fact, that's how those antennas were put on the Sears tower at the end, was they were airlifted in by helicopters, and they even had welders that were hanging by ropes from those helicopters that welded them into place, which is kind of scary to think about, but how else are you going to get those on top of that building, right? All right, now the Merchandise Mart is here to our left. This was the first Art Deco building we talked about, and I want to point out my favorite part of the Merchandise Mart. And that's over here to the right, this glass box mounted on the side of the Riverwalk there. It's every night in the summer, twice a night. It starts on May 1st this year. That box displays digital animated art on the walls of the merchandise. A number of institutions in town, including the Field Museum, the Art Institute, Museum of Contemporary Art, among others, they take turns displaying their art on the Mart. And the coolest part is that these designers have made sure to leave out window-sized holes from their projections so that no light shines through the windows and disturbs the tenants inside. So it just displays on that external limestone facade. Above the South Street Bridge, for my money, is one of the most underrated views on the river. And I'll tell you why. I think it's like a beautiful puzzle. You can see that each building up ahead fits really nicely into its spot. And it's such a snapshot of Chicago throughout history. You've got some Art Deco, you've got some contemporary buildings, you've got contextualism, even a little bit of postmodern architecture. And I think it's just such a good representation of the broader Chicago skyline there. All right, folks, we're about to pass under the LaSalle Street Bridge. Now, this is an important north-south street in the city of Chicago. And back in 1930, the city wanted to expand it. They wanted to make it wider because it was so busy. But the problem was this brick building that you're seeing coming into view on our left. This is the Reed Murdoch Center, built in 1914 as a grocery warehouse. And if you look closely to the right side of the clock tower, there are 6 bays of windows, but to the left there are only 5. And that's because when they expanded LaSalle Street, they simply chopped the end of the building off. They said, you can stay, but you're getting chopped. Pretty straightforward solution to that problem. All right, my actual favorite building on the river, up ahead on the right, this short, squat concrete building with a 55 near the roof. This is the only example that we're going to see on the river today of a very short-lived architectural style from the late 1960s called Brutalism. Now, it does look brutal, right? It's got those deep, dark windows, dark textured concrete, kind of looks like a bunker. But Brutalism actually comes from the French béton brut, which means raw or rough concrete. So that textured concrete is standard in the Brutalist style, and this style was typically found in sturdy institutional buildings like banks and courthouses. This one here is a bank, and that's because it was intended to make folks feel safe against the turbulent times of the late 1960s. That's why it does look like it's my favorite building, so that tells you what I think of Danny DeVito. I'm a big Danny DeVito fan. A really interesting building story. Up ahead on the right, this narrow, dark green tower with the gold trim up on top. This is the Carbide and Carbon building from 1929, currently known as Hotel Pendry. And that's when alcohol was illegal in the US. And so it is believed that the designers intended for it to look like a bottle of champagne as a protest against prohibition. So that gold trim up on top is the gold foil wrapped around the cork, right? And in fact, that's real 24 karat gold leaf. But don't get any bright ideas, go up there, scrape it off, make some cash. It's only half the thickness of saran base around them, right? This is such a good comparison between the architecture that you'll find here in a city like Chicago in the Midwest versus architecture typically found on the East Coast. All right, folks, the Wrigley Building here on our left. This was one of the first buildings we talked about with the clock tower on the roof. I mentioned it was modeled after that Spanish cathedral. Well, our next cathedral is coming into view just to its right, a little further back, Chicago Tribune Tower. And if you thought this was a church, that's a great guess, and that's because this one was also modeled after a cathedral, but this time it was in France. So we call this French Gothic Revival style architecture. Now the Chicago Tribune, that's the city's largest newspaper. They operated in there from 1925 to 2018, not quite 100 years. They sold it, they moved out, and it is now being converted into high-end condos. We're talking multiple millions of dollars to live up there when they're all here. Now, if that name DuSable sounds familiar, that's because he was the first name we mentioned on the tour. He was the founder of the city of Chicago, yeah. He was an immigrant from Haiti of French and African descent. And I think it's really important to remind folks that DuSable was the first non-indigenous permanent settler, because to our right is a reminder that we are on Potawatomi land. Now, the Potawatomi is a tribe of Native American people who lived here long before DuSable and other Chicago settlers came along. See that black boxy building that says James Hardie near the roof? Well, coming into view in just a moment, above and behind it, you'll notice a building that's covered in white fins. This is Aqua Tower. It's a high-end residence and hotel, and those fins are actually all balconies, and they're all uniquely shaped. And the idea is that if you stand next to the Aqua Tower at ground level and you look up at the side of that building, those balconies look like rippling waves of water around the outside of the building. It's really stunning. So I recommend, if you find yourself on this side of the river, go stand next to the Aqua, look up, take some photos. You'll get some really incredible Instagram pics. So I want to point out those two floors near the top of the tall tower that don't have any windows. You see those? Those are the 83rd and 84th floors. And do you all remember the concrete tanks of water on 150 North Riverside that cut down on the sway? This is a system designed for a similar purpose. Those are called blow-through floors. And the idea is that when wind hits the side of that tall tower, a lot of the wind is going to be funneled through those. But in recent years, TripAdvisor has ranked this tour that you're on with Shoreline as the #1 tour experience in the country. We're really proud of that. In fact, there was one year where they ranked us as the #2 tour experience in the entire world. All right, up ahead, past the bridge here, you see this black curvy building that looks like a giant stack of fidget spinners? This is Lake Point Tower. It's an example of curvilinear modernism, built in 1968. And you'll notice that it's the only skyscraper on the lakefront. Yeah, the only building on the other side of this bridge. And that's because when the city was first founded, the founders made an important decision, and that was that they wanted to preserve the natural beauty of the lakefront and make sure that it remained accessible for all Chicagoans. The Chicago Lock is also at the corner of these walls. But now, why do we need these retaining walls and the Chicago Lock? Well, it's because the lake is at a record high. It's actually over 6 feet higher than the river right now, because as it turns out, lake levels also rise along with sea levels due to climate change. So, if we didn't have those walls and that lock there, yeah, all that water from the lake would come rushing through the city, which would be pretty catastrophic. But it also allows boats to travel between those two bodies of water safely. Yeah, that's what the Chicago Lock does, so that boats can travel between the lake 6 feet higher than the lower river. And of course, you got Navy Pier up ahead to our left. You can see the iconic Navy Pier Ferris wheel. Wheel actually debuted at the 1893 World's Fair. That was right here in Chicago. The original Ferris wheel from that fair was 70 feet taller than that one. It held 2,100 people total. Each car was the size of a school bus. 61 people in each car, and of course the 61st person in every car was a bartender. All for tap rooms. If you've got a tab open with Laney, go ahead and close that out. Look for any trash you might have gathered on the trip, throw that away for us. We'd be grateful for that. And again, I'll be walking up and down the aisles again.
Done with river cruise. With this, I'm ending this episode here. Thank you for watching. Have a wonderful day.